to introduce our speaker as part of the University of Oregon African American Speaker Series. Bakari Sellers is a CNN political analyst and a former representative from South Carolina. He made history in 2006 when, at just 22 years old, so the same age as some of our students here, he defeated a 26-year incumbent state representative to become the youngest member of the South Carolina state legislature and the youngest African-American elected official in the nation. In 2014, Sellers won the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor and is widely considered to be a rising star within the Democratic Party and the leading voice of his generation. He earned his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, where he served as student body president, and his law degree from the University of South Carolina. Notice they put law last in his biography. He has followed in the footsteps of his father, civil rights leader, Dr. Cleveland Sellers, in his tireless commitment to public service while championing progressive policies to address issues ranging from education and poverty to preventing domestic violence and childhood obesity. Sellers served on President Barack Obama's South Carolina Steering Committee during the 2008 election. He has received numerous accolades, including being named Time Magazine's 40 Under 40 in 2010, the Route 100 list of the nation's most influential African Americans in 2014. He practices law with the Strom Law Firm in Columbia, South Carolina, and is a CNN contributor. Please join me in welcoming Bakari Sellers.
The first thing I always get is, I didn't know you were this tall. You don't look this tall on TV. So I'm going to raise the microphone a little bit. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I am from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light. And my mom and dad would always say that the 2 most important words in the English language are the words thank you, because they're not nearly said enough. And before I begin, I want to thank a few people who are here in the audience today. The first is your president, Dr. Schill, because my father was a college president, and I understand that sometimes, oftentimes, this can be a relatively thankless job. But the University of Oregon is an institution that we look at from miles around and say that is an institution of higher education that is doing great work, that is doing God's work. And you are intentional about diversity and inclusion, and that's very important. So thank you very much for what you are doing here today. For your vice president who makes all of this happen, you deserve every accolade that you get. I always tell people you should give them their flowers while they are living. This room, on what is a breezy day in Oregon, is filled because of your leadership. And so thank you so very much. I have city councilmen in the building with me from Lane Community College. I will be there later this afternoon. Greg Evans, thank you so very much for being here. My nephew is here. Brandon, stand up so everybody can see you. There you go, wave. I don't know if any of his teachers are in here, but he paid me $20 to say that if he misses class the rest of the day, he's with me, so he has a good excuse. And you know, I am today, and to the planners of this event, thank you, because when I looked, I saw that the individual singing the Black National Anthem was only singing the first verse. And so thank you for allowing us to get out of here at a reasonable time. And I am going to treat all of you all today a lot like Elizabeth Taylor treated all 7 of her husbands, and that means I'm not going to keep you long. I always enjoy speaking at Martin Luther King Day ceremonies. oftentimes because we forget what Dr. King's true legacy was. As we get further and further away from his assassination, and I have to remind people that Dr. King did not die in his sleep. Dr. King did not just simply have cancer and fade away into the heavens. Dr. King was taken from us in the most vicious, hateful way that a man can be taken. Oftentimes have to remind people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary. And as we look back over history, oftentimes his legacy has been whitewashed. But even more importantly, Dr. King gave us a challenge which I will give you here today. He said that we must go on this journey. And for the purposes of our discussion today, we remember that life is not a singular step, but life is a series of steps. Life is a journey, and every journey must have a destination. And I think Dr. King would approve of our destination today because we're going to take a journey to excellence. But in order to take this journey, we have to ask ourselves two very simple questions. And I apologize beforehand for bombarding you with questions that are rooted in such simplicity, but they're necessary to answer as we navigate this journey to excellence. The first is, how far have we come? And the next is, where do we go from here? Now, in answering that first question of how far have we come, it's necessary that we use some historical context. And for me, I like to think about a family not far from where I was born in Clarendon County, South Carolina. They were known as the Briggs family. The Briggs family, they only wanted their children to have the same opportunity as white kids, which was to ride the school bus to and from school. Black kids in Clarendon County oftentimes had to walk up to 9 miles one way. And so they filed a lawsuit against the superintendent in Clarendon County, South Carolina, and that lawsuit, known as Briggs v. Elliott, filed in 1949, was the first case that was filed in the landmark collection of cases known as Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, ironically enough, in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and I'm going to take you back to your law school days, Dean Schill, make sure I get this holding right, but Chief Justice Warren got a very rare unanimous opinion in which he held that segregation causes a sense of inferiority by putting children in environments not conducive to learning. Now, some 60 years since, ask yourself that very simple question: how far have we come? I like to think back to 1946, and there was a young man named George Elmore. Now, see, George Elmore was a Renaissance Negro. George Elmore was so fair-skinned that he could pass for being white. But George Elmore was considered a Renaissance Negro because he owned a five and dime store. He owned a liquor store. He owned a photography company on the side. But George had the audacity to believe that he was going to go down and register to vote in the 1940s. So George showed up at the voter registration office, and you know they gave George his voter registration card. But that August, when he went to vote in the Democratic primary, the poll worker said, "George, we know you're a Negro. You can't vote here." But George was a man who was filled with pride. So George filed a lawsuit. He said, "You will not turn me away." That lawsuit was known as Elmore versus Rice, and as soon as he filed the lawsuit, they firebombed his liquor store. They stopped distributing to his five and dime store. They burned crosses on his front yard, and George Elmore, his wife, literally died in a mental health facility because of all the mental anguish and trauma that she had to endure. You see, George Elmore, he died a very broken man emotionally, mentally, and physically. But George Elmore is the reason, and Elmore versus Rice is the reason that African Americans can now vote in primaries in this country. So again, ask yourself that very simple question: how far have we come? And the last story I like to remember is one from 1954. There was a young woman named Sarah Mae Fleming. How many people have ever heard of Sarah Mae Fleming? Sarah Mae Fleming was a bad, bad woman. She was a 22-year-old domestic worker. One day, she and one of her girlfriends got off work, and they felt a little weary and tired. This story may sound a little familiar to many of you all. But Sarah Mae Fleming decided that she was going to get on the bus to go home, and she decided she was going to sit at the front of the bus. But you see, that wasn't her sin. Her sin was that when the bus driver told her to get off the bus, she didn't go through the back door that the Negroes or the coloreds at that time went through. She went through the front door, and the bus driver punched her in the stomach and rode her down the steps. You see, Sarah Mae Fleming, she wasn't looking to be a hero that day. She didn't wake up and say that I am going to be etched into history that day. In fact, she reminds me of Isaiah in the book of Isaiah when he was in the full awe and glory of the Lord, and he said, "And whom shall go for me?" And Isaiah said, "Here am I, Lord, send me." She wasn't trying to make history that day, but she said, "Here am I, send me." So she joined with some enterprising lawyers from the NAACP, and they filed a lawsuit, and Sarah Mae Fleming, she laid the foundation in action and law for another young lady who sat down some 17 months later named Rosa Parks. So again, I ask yourself that very simple question: how far have we come? And when I think back at it, and I think about the Briggs family, and I think about the fact that children still go to school in this country where their heating and air don't work, where their infrastructure is falling apart, where teachers are overworked and underpaid, where you're punished because of the zip code that you're born into, and you ask yourself that very simple question: how far have you come? I think you'll get one very simple answer. And when I think back to Sarah Mae Fleming and all she wanted was access to public transportation, and I think about the fact that many black and brown and poor people in this country still don't have access to public accommodations and public housing and public transportation and even clean air and clean water. What if I told you there were 100 cities in this country, in these United States of America, where they have a higher lead concentration than that of Flint, Michigan? And I think if you ask yourself that very simple question, how far have we come, I think you will come to one very simple answer. And then I think about George Elmore and the fact that he had to see his wife die in that state, that he had to give up everything that he had worked so hard for simply so that he would have access to the franchise of voting. And now we live in times where people try to make it that much more difficult to vote. Thank God for your governor of Oregon. But people try to make it that much more difficult to vote, and then there are many people who are in the generation that I reside in who do not still understand the importance thereof. And you ask yourself again that very simple question: how far have we come? And again, Madam Vice President, I will tell you that I have come to the resolve in my 34 years of great wisdom that the answer to the question, how far have we come, is that we've made progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. So as we take this journey to excellence together, our challenge is to now pivot and ask ourselves the next question, which is, where do we go from here? You see, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in one of his better pieces of writing, now I think it's his second best piece of writing, and no, the I Have a Dream speech is not the first. I think the letter from the Birmingham jail is his best piece of writing. If you think it's I Have a Dream, we can fight later. It's okay. But he gave us these two choices. Where do we go from here? He gave us the choice of chaos or community. You see, I know a lot of you all see me in a little box on TV. A lot of times I'm on Don Lemon or Chris Cuomo or Anderson Cooper. And we're going back and forth, and no matter what the little breaking news headline under me reads, it can just say chaos. Chaos at 1600, or chaos in Syria, or chaos at the border, or chaos at TSA, or just chaos times more chaos. But you see, the challenge that we all have, and I think the most important part of Dr. King's legacy, is that all of us have to dedicate ourselves to building community. Let me tell you a story about a young man who was born at 633 Frederick Street in the big city of Denmark. When he was 10 years old, his life was changed forever. He would oftentimes say that when he was 10, he found out who the strongest woman in the world was. You see, there was another young man who had just been brutalized and murdered in Mississippi, named Emmett Till. And I know many of you all know the story of Emmett Till. If you don't, take out your phones. I don't mind. I got stock in Verizon, so y'all can answer your phones. And Emmett Till's mother was so strong because I don't know if you all have some black folk or some grandparents that used to have Jet magazines. But you see, Emmett Till's mother allowed for her son, after he was brutalized and did not have any bones left in his body, his face looking like a pancake, to be photographed in an open casket. And that picture actually made it into Jet magazine. And this young man from Denmark said that Emmett Till's mother was the strongest woman he had ever heard of in his life. And so he ripped that picture out and put it in his wallet, and he began his journey in the freedom movement. He began to lead sit-ins in his hometown, and his parents were middle class. And his parents were scared, not just for his safety, but for their own economic security. And so his parents said, "We got to get you out of Denmark." Ironically enough, they sent him to Howard University. And when he got to Howard University, he befriended a young man named Stokely Carmichael. Stokely graduated from Howard University, began to convince this young man from Denmark to drop out of school. Drop out of school and join this little small group of bandits called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And one of his first tasks was he went up to Miami University of Ohio, and I know there's a young lady in here who was sharing her story with me as well. Where is she? There she is. She knows all about Holly Springs in Mississippi. In Miami University of Ohio, an institution that is not, its place in history is not told enough, where they actually train workers to go down and register voters in the Delta. And this young man from Denmark actually got a phone call that he was going to have to go to Philadelphia, Mississippi. How many of y'all are from Philadelphia or have ever been to Philadelphia, Mississippi? It's the size, no, you haven't been to Philadelphia, sir. It's the size of this conference room, ain't no bigger. And their task was to look for the bodies of 3 of their fellow slain civil rights workers. See, during the day, they would hide in barns and sheds, and at night, they would go out and look in ditches and trenches, and they were looking for Goodman, Schroeder, and Cheney. Ironically enough, they found these bodies behind the home of one of the local sheriff's deputies and ministers in the town. That was this young man from Denmark's first indoctrination, true indoctrination into the civil rights movement, and then he came home. He ended up becoming national field director for SNCC, and then he came home. He came home to South Carolina and became involved in the most deadly civil rights demonstration this country has ever seen. He became involved in the most deadly civil rights demonstration this country has ever seen. You see, on the night of February 6th, 1968, the students at South Carolina State College, as it was known at the time, decided they were going to protest the All-Star Bowling Alley, which sits back in a right angle. The history books call the All-Star Bowling Alley the last vestige of discrimination, Jim Crow's final hiding place. The plan was for 3 students to go into the bowling alley and get arrested, and so they could fight this out in the courts of law. But when they got down there and they began to clap and chant and sing protest hymns, state troopers and city police began to surround many of the students and press up against the students, and the students began to press up against the glass, and then the glass broke. When the glass broke, all hell broke loose, and many of the students began to be beaten by police, and they were beaten with police batons, but not normal batons. They were beaten with batons that were about this long, and at the end they had these leather rawhide whips. There's a young man named James Stroman who tells a story about being there that night and seeing 2 state troopers hold one young lady while another one beat her. On that night, the students, they had to go back to their campus and they had to heal not only their physical wounds, but their mental wounds and emotional wounds as well. Then came February 7th, 1968, and I think the saying was, older people say the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Well, for me, I guess I'll relay it to when y'all are playing Oregon State and you in the parking lot after the game and you feel like something about to pop off. Is that type of unease? That's what it felt like on the 7th, but nothing happened. But then came that fateful day of February 8th, 1968, when the students, they went to their campus and they began to build this bonfire after they protested at the bowling alley. See, they had got the right idea. They went back to their campus. They went back to their campus. They went back to their campus because they felt safe in their communion, because they had gathered together much as we've gathered here today for a singular cause and a common good, but they could not foresee what would happen next. You know, they did not foresee that South Carolina State troopers would line up along the embankment in front of their beloved campus. They did not foresee that these state troopers would have shotguns that were loaded with deadly double-aught buckshots. They were around a bonfire, and you can imagine what a bonfire is like in the deep South in February. It's not too cold, but it's just cool, and the embers, how they just illuminate the darkness and the warmth, it just warms up your bones ever so gently. And for 8 seconds, 1001, 1002, 1003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those state troopers, they fired those buckshots of the same bullets we used to hunt deer into the group of students. It killed 3, Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton. It wounded another 28. This young man from Denmark was shot in the shoulder that night. He went to the infirmary, and they told him there was nothing they could do for him there. He had to go to the hospital. When he got to the hospital, he was pointed out by the only black sheriff's deputy in Orangeburg County at the time, and he was arrested. He was arrested and charged with 5 felony counts, looking at a maximum of 75 years in prison. In between the night of his arrest and the day of his trial, all 9 officers who fired shots into the group of students were tried, and all 9 officers were found not guilty. But this young man from Denmark, he went to trial, and the lead investigator said that he had misplaced the evidence, but he did remember this young man from Denmark, not on the night of the 8th, but on the night of the 6th, standing on top of a fire truck and yelling, "Burn, baby, burn." So his indictment was backdated from February 8th to February 6th, and he was charged, tried, and convicted of rioting, effectively becoming the first and only one-man riot in the history of this country. You see, on that night, injustice, it left mothers without their sons. It left the pages of my state's history stained red with blood. But if you look at this young man from Denmark and you ask him, what's the greatest sacrifice he had to make, and you see that his eyes don't pop like they used to from shedding so many tears from so many loved ones lost throughout the freedom movement, and you see that his shoulders don't stand as upright as they once did from carrying the burdens of so many generations, and you say, what is the greatest sacrifice you make? He'll say it wasn't being in jail or losing his freedom per se. It wasn't being housed on death row while his bond was denied, but it was being in jail for the birth of his oldest daughter, or my big sister. Because this young man from Denmark who grew up into a civil rights hero is my father, Cleveland Sellers. And you see the lessons that you learn from people like Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond and Delano Middleton and Jimmy Lee Jackson and Majeska Simpkins and Septima Clark and Medgar Evers and Emmett Till and James Foreman and Marion Barry and Julian Bond. Let me back up. I don't let anybody talk bad about Marion Barry in my presence. And Andy Young and Maynard Jackson and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. All of these names, the George Elmores, the Elliots, the Sarah Mae Fleming, even before you get to Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, teach us that the answer to the question, where do we go from here, lies fundamentally in the ability for us to do 2 things. Now, one is easy and one is damn hard. But the first thing is we have to believe what King said, but we have to take it one step further because we have to learn how to dream with our eyes open. That means that we live in a culture of low expectation in this country now, and now we have to, again, teach young people how to dream because you can't tell a poor black kid he can be a doctor if he's never seen a black doctor. You can't tell a poor black kid that he can be a dentist if he's never seen a black dentist. So you have to teach these kids and teach these young people and those who are young at heart to dream with their eyes open, to be that example. And the second thing is, which I struggle with, and many of you all see me on TV struggling with this concept, is we have to rededicate ourselves to the proposition of loving our neighbors. But see, this is what King talked about, which is why it's so hard, especially in this climate, because we have to love our neighbors even when they don't love us. And that's the most difficult challenge that we have. So as we're on this journey to excellence and we ask ourselves that very simple question of how far have we come, I think that we understand that we've made progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. And as we pivot and we ask ourselves the next question, which is, where do we go from here? I think we understand that we have to dream with our eyes open in order to be able to see what that answer is. And we also have to love our neighbors even when they don't love us. But I think the last thing we have to do on this journey is fully understand what it means to be excellent. And I think sometimes institutions of higher learning and even all of us in this room who are well-read even forget what excellence is. And so I'll leave you with this. I firmly believe, with all due respect, if you're an educator in this room, you can be number 2. But Benjamin E. Mays is the greatest educator of all time. There would be no Martin Luther King Jr. if there was no Benjamin E. Mays. And Benjamin E. Mays once said, in all things that you do them so well that no man living, dead, or yet to be born can do them better. That's the definition of excellence. You see, that was Dr. King's dream, Dr. King's dream was not just to exalt him to a place where we whitewashed all of his accomplishments, whitewashed who he was as a revolutionary, forget that he actually understood what the smell of gun smoke was and laid on jailhouse floors. It wasn't for us to forget the fact that he had a 33% approval rating at the time of his death. The President of the United States, the 45th President of the United States today has an approval rating of 39%. Martin Luther King Jr. at his death had an approval rating of 33%. So let's not forget who this man was. But let's hold him up and hold up all of those other heroes and sheroes, because without those names, many of which you have acknowledged because of your amazing vice president here on this campus, without those names, we would not have the success that we have today. So I don't know where we will be at the end of the day, but I am on this journey to excellence. I am on this journey to excellence because I understand, as King understood, that you may not get rich and your name may not be in lights. But all of those shoulders of those heroes and sheroes that you stand upon, when they are long and gone, they will be able to look down upon you and simply say, job well done. Thank you, and God bless you all.